Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this ongoing transmission on the budget that is going to be announced shortly. And there are a lot of questions as far as the common man is concerned as to how this budget is going to go forward as far as their vows are concerned. A lot of speculations are there as well with the different parts of the community. The current government is trying its utmost as far as to alleviate all the issues that concern different sects of Pakistan, especially the lower middle class. Nevertheless, we will all have to wait and see as to how things go. Yesterday, the Pakistan Economic Survey 2021-2022 was also unveiled, more around 500-page book, including different details. If I just go through them very shortly, the economy grew by 5.97%, inflation touched 11.3%, trade deficit reached $45 billion. Had it not been for the current account deficit and balance of payment crisis, we might have had a good GDP. Nevertheless, this is what plagued us during the last year, and now the current government is trying to come out of the crisis. To talk more about that, how much should we expect from this coming budget, we've been joined by one guest in the studio and will be joining by others who will be joining us online. In the studios, we've been joined by Javed Hassan Saab, who is an economic columnist for Arab News and former chairman NAVTCC, chairman EAG as well. Thank you very much, sir, to have joined us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, of course, we're seeing each other after quite some time, but nevertheless, it's always a pleasure. Javed Saab, you must have seen all right. Before we come to you, Javed Saab, we've also been joined by Dr. Manzoor Ahmed Saab, who's former advisor, World Bank, on Skype, and also Amir Zafar Durrani Saab. He's the president, Reenergia. He's also there. Pleasure to have you both. And I think that the discussion before the budget speech starts is going to be quite exciting economy-wise. Let's start with our guests in the studios. Javed Saab, Pakistan Economic Survey 2021-22 is unveiled. A lot of things are put to the public. A lot of things are told. 5.97% growth rate is being a real growth rate, but they say it has been hampered by the current account deficit and the balance of payment crisis. Can the government come out of it, seeing the current scenario that this government has taken, and the way we see the reactions of different world bodies as far as Pakistan's economic status is concerned?
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. I think that 6%, 5.97% growth on the face of it looks excellent. Pakistan has not achieved such a high level of growth in consecutive years for a long time. Having said that, it has come at a huge cost. And it is not hampered. I would say one of the reasons why we have a large trade deficit has been fueled by this excellent growth. Had we not had this kind of growth, we might not have had the $45 billion trade deficit. So the growth comes at a cost, and we have to keep that in mind. Nothing comes in life without a cost.
That's true.
And so we have to be very mindful of the fact that can we afford continue growing at this kind of pace? And that's the big challenge. In a country which has a fast growing population, it needs growth. At the same time, it probably doesn't have the capacity right now to grow at the sort of 6% level, which inevitably leads to a blowout in terms of balance of payments deficits as well as trade deficits. Both of them are obviously connected.
And of course, trade deficit is $45 billion,
what is really critical to understand in this, it leads to a balance of payments crisis.
And that is what was highlighted by Miftah Ismail Saab, because it's something that has hampered this 5.97%, a real growth rate that has been expected.
We have to remember that in the next 1 year, over the next 12 months, we have repayments, principal repayments of about 20 billion, 21 billion, it probably is the exact number. If we are going to have repayments of about 20, some of it might be rollover, but dependent on whether we're back in the EFF program of IMF, 20 billion of repayments, 21 billion of repayments, plus if we assume at the current rate of balance trade deficit, or balance of payments deficit of 1 billion a month, another 12 billion, we're potentially looking at financing requirement of 30 billion, 31 billion over the next 12 months. That's a large ask from any government. So we will need a lot of financing from international markets, obviously from the multilateral agencies like IMF and World Bank, as well as our friends.
All
For
right.
all of this, we would need to have a budget which is acceptable not only to our people, which is critically important. We are a sovereign nation, and it has to be approved and accepted by the sovereign people. But it also, unfortunately, has certain requirements in meeting international lenders who are very important stakeholders in this.
All right. Manzoor Ahmed Saab, when it comes to the balance of payment crisis, do you feel that the previous government could have taken measures to control it, or do you feel it was inevitable?
Extremely difficult to control it, because if you analyze what the imports were, despite saying that there's luxury goods, etc., but over 90%, 92% or something were essential goods like petroleum, like industrial raw materials, etc., and all those things. So I don't think, no matter, we already have one of the highest tariff rates and everything we did, but those goods for a population of our size and, it's not really, not even adequate. So they couldn't really have help there. But what could have been done was to give more attention to exports. Maybe they did something. They did in the initial period. They started with this tariff reforms to let industrial sector have lower duties on their imports so that they are more competitive. But then they stopped the process there because of their many other problems. And the other big problem that hampered everything was our industrial, our energy crisis. And unfortunately, it was something domestic, but mostly also international. We all know the way petroleum prices jumped from almost at one time 3 years ago from zero to now over $100, for petrol and per barrel. And it was the same for LNG, same for coal, same for everything, and all these things came together. And I think one of the big problems for this deficit was that you look at any price, our major imports, like say edible oil, the prices jumped by 300%. So it was not really the quantity; it was the prices that jumped up, and that was, that's one reason that it went so high.
All right, Amir Zafar Durrani Saab, we've discussed economy many a times in the past as well, and this time I'd like to have your point of view as far as the public sector development program is concerned. Hassan Iqbal Saab, when he was addressing the launching of the Pakistan Economic Survey 2021-22 yesterday, said that we are on a roadmap to sustainable and inclusive growth. At the same time, just a couple of minutes back, one of our correspondents has given us some figures as far as the PSDP figures for this year's budget are concerned. 2,263 billion rupees for the PSDP, of which 180 billion for NHA and 44.17 billion allocated for the higher education services. Then there are others for health, for railways and other sectors. When it comes to the PSDP, how important is that a segment of the budget, and how has the previous government taken care enough of this sector so that this current government can move forward in a more or less sustainable manner?
Well, thank you very much, Khalid. I think one of the things that we need to be very cognizant about, since you specifically pigeonholed me into talking about the PSDP is essentially the equivalent of the annual development plan of the provinces. Now, fundamentally, this is in many ways the principal fiscal component that the government contributes to the growth of the economy in terms of creating jobs, in terms of bringing around stimulus because they build infrastructure, right? A lot of the PSDP infrastructure, if you look at the fundamental shift, so I'll talk about what's coming in the budget and then what's being presented at the Planning Commission. And you see that they are basically financing 60% of the old schemes, which is the continuing, we call it basically the throw forward. And then they have 40% new schemes, which they are very upfront about saying that this is required since they have to appease the coalition. So where now this problem starts arising is that PSDP is also, along with the provincial ADPs, as you know, there is a 12% increase in the NFC, the Finance Commission award, to the provinces. So the net pie has increased, not that the NFC award formula has changed, which again signals trouble. So let me tell you about trouble number one. So trouble number one is essentially about, let's start with the provinces. This is the time that you have a coalition that is by and large supportive of the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment's primary purpose was to empower the provinces, amongst other things, not to make sure that PVP gains a stranglehold in Sindh, but essentially the intent of that was to provide for the provinces to collect more revenue and do more local spending and completely move towards ending the reliance on the federation. Now, 70 plus years hence, Pakistan is probably one of the only federating unit country where, you can take the US as an example, you can take the Germany as an example. We are still, literally spoon feeding, or as you say, bottle feeding our provinces. Whereas if you look at the capacity, and we talked about debt and all that, the capacity of the provinces to raise capital is very, very high, and yet they are not doing it. So I think any decrease overall in the PSDP and the ADPs, to me, will signal fiscal efficiency and effectiveness. That goes against judgment, but honestly, if we are increasing and bringing new schemes into this fiscal pot, which is my second point, whether it be at the federal level, whether it be at the provincial level, then what that means is 40% of infrastructure is going to be built on people's whims to provide votes. Now, that's not a very efficient way of allocating your revenue, or state revenue. So, I mean, on the overall, I think the PSDP, one of the things that is going to differ this year from the previous 3 years is that, no matter how much you blame the previous government for not initiating new schemes, so they didn't do some ribbon cutting on new bridges and flyovers and highways and all that. But at the same time, if you go and look at the budget they allocated to continuing projects, which means finishing what we've started, which is a very efficient thing to do, was much higher. So now this year, with this coming in, I think again, I see some sort of a problem. In the previous years, the government had gone out of business because government was not signing new contracts with the private sector. As you know, the government is not only the largest provider of employment, but is also the largest provider of contracts to private sector, unlike many other countries in the world, and unlike especially the OECD countries. So this is a bit troubling, but at the same time, I don't know. Let's see what happens.
Let's see what happens, and we'll shortly know how things are allocated. And of course, we have certain numbers, but it's better to wait for the actual budget speech to begin. Nevertheless, Miftah Ismail Saab has said that PTI has left them with a 5,000 billion rupees deficit. Coming back to you, Javed, when Hassan Iqbal Saab says that we are on the road to a sustainable and inclusive growth, is that road going to be a bumpy one?
It's going to be a difficult one, undoubtedly. If I may just come back to one point.
All right.
In terms of the growth last year, there was a certain thought that it's inevitable and we had to grow. One of the things the government could have done, and I don't mean to be critical of it, they could have tried to constrain the demand. There was no effort to actually constrain demand. If you have large expanding demand, you would have more imports of oil, which is major import is actually fuel. So we had large increments in growth, both in industrial sector and in overall consumption demand. It wasn't investment demand in terms of productive capacity. So we need to think very carefully going forward, what kind of demand are we generating and what kind of growth are we generating? A lot of our growth tends to be consumption-led growth. And really, we need to be careful about this. Now, in terms of, I come back to your question about sustainability. We will be able to grow sustainably so long as our investments is in actually productive capacity. A lot of investment that does take place in Pakistan, whether it's in housing or in other areas, tends to be in consumption-driven investment, so-called investment. And that is the problem. We are not really increasing our productivity or our productive capacity. So even in terms of exports, unless you start generating exportable surpluses, you'll not be able to really grow exports. There's a limited amount how much we can grow.
True.
So these are questions we need to ask. You know, there's an ADB report, which is a relatively not that old, which says we have balance of payments constrained growth of about 4 to 4.5%.
Yes.
Now, we need to keep that in mind. And any time we tend to grow, that happened in 2018, it's happening now in 2022. Anytime we start touching 5.5%, 6%, our trade balances go out of whack. So that is the question. I think we can definitely, we are a sovereign nation and we are a very capable nation, but we need to think about our productive capacities and whether we can do so. And Hassan Saab is very, knows the business quite well, and I'm sure he's focusing on that.
Let's hope so. And we will, of course, a lot of, how should I say, thoughts and eyes are focused on what is going to be the budget speech, what are going to be the figures, and how the government is going to handle the current economic crisis that it has been, it has inherited. Coming to you, Dr. Manzoor Saab, coming to different aspects of Pakistan's economy, let's talk also about the foreign direct investment, which yesterday we were told it was about 1.25 billion. Do you feel that the measures that the government will be taking or that have been announced yesterday as to how the government might go forward will prove to be beneficial for the FDI? Do you feel the FDI is an important component of strengthening our economy? And if so, do you feel also that our government needs to work more robustly with the other embassies that are present across the world so that the Pakistani expatriates could be involved in a more strengthened manner?
Well, as for FDI is concerned, I think our record recently, at least for the last 10, 15 years, has been very poor. I mean, except for that period when CPEC investments came in. Otherwise, it's hardly anything. 1-2 billion, that's nothing. And in fact, we send out more than we're getting. And there are, many factors. But one of the factors is that we have too many regulations and too much uncertainty. And then there are too many litigations with our foreign investors. And any recent thing you look at, whatever came, we somehow ended up in some litigation. We have to find a way that, these LNG contracts, they're already fighting international, this mining, anything, So we have to find a way to settle these so that we don't end up litigating. Once a contract is signed, then another government comes and then it's the cancellation, etc. That should not happen. That's very bad. But the other thing is that we have to open up our economy a little bit, despite everyone saying that there's too many imports, etc. But we need more investment, more machinery coming in, more raw materials, and more exports going out. And without, our big problem is exports. I mean, that's I think we have been stagnant for almost, from 2010. To now, we are not even double the exports where we were then, and so I think whatever we can do to bring in FDI, where I think the FDI, there's some good reports there, and they know what's been wrong, but somehow there's some problem with implementation. So bringing in FDI, and one thing they can immediately do is that all this slowing up of CPEC, they can reinvigorate it. And get those projects and those industrial zones and other things. Maybe Amir wants to say something here. Go ahead, Amir. I don't know.
With Khalid,
Yes, you wanted to add something to that, Amir?
Yeah. Actually, I want to pick up on both these and really kind of take what Dr. Manzoor is saying. I mean, at the beginning of the show, we sort of had Javed said very rightly that, Pakistan has always had this issue when it starts growing, the economy starts heating up, which means inflation starts rising. We are unable to control our balance of payments. But I think over time, having thought about this for 20 plus years and also during our interventions during the World Bank time, I think here is the problem. And I think this takes a cue from what Dr. Manzoor had just said. The balance of payment and the heating will not require, the answer is not to stunt growth, not to artificially control demand, but here are the solutions. Number one, essentially improve your ability to bring in foreign direct investment, which is what Dr. Manzoor is saying, because really America is the largest deficit economy in the world and they live on two things, their currency and their deficits. Number two, that essentially the energy as a percent, currently if you look at our energy, the percentage of that energy, especially electricity that we bring to use, whether it be commercial, industrial or household, is more reliant on Forex. So the biggest dent is in Forex is coming from, as Javed also pointed out, is the import of oil. The second part is transport. But my solution is forget about getting clean. Make sure you generate energy locally by hell or high water. Forget about grid factors. Last thing, curbing unnecessary mobility. Now, curbing unnecessary mobility is not curbing demand. So and it doesn't mean that you close borders. People want to buy nice big cars, which is not even, as Manzoor said, 2% of what we are spending on. So let the borders be open, bring down tariffs to almost zero, but at the same time, put and curb demand in a way. So in other words, anyone who travels more than 20 kilometers, make sure Islamabad highway, people have to pay a toll. Even in Dubai, you can't travel from more than 5 kilometers without paying exorbitant amounts of money. So what do people do? Luckily, in Pakistan, we already have two-wheel mobility. So we need to finance that. And I think this really, for us, is the way forward. Thanks for allowing me the intervention.
If I may.
All right.
If I may intervene.
Of course, do.
I think nobody likes controlling demand and slowing growth. We're as I said, fast-growing population and we need to grow. Having said that, we are in a crisis situation. We have our state bank reserves at 9.2 billion. Of that, actually usable reserves are probably around 5 billion. So we literally, given our run rate of current account deficit, we probably are just 1 or 2 months away from running out of cash. And we're already finding banks are not being able to take LCs without 100% cash. The point is, those wonderful things like FDI and international investments, they're really wonderful and we do desperately need them. But until that happens, we are constrained by certain balance of payment constraints.
True.
And we have to be cognizant of that reality. And until we can get FDIs coming in, and that FDI will depend on our internal capabilities. It's not simply, I totally agree with Manzoor Sahab 100% that we need to open up, we need to reduce tariffs, we need to be a much more connected economy, we need to increase our FTAs and interconnectivity with the region, all of that, but all of that takes time. In the meanwhile, we need to stabilize the economy. And for that, we need to be very cognizant of what our requirements in terms of external obligations are.
All right. When it comes to external obligations, Dr. Manzoor Ahmed, and when we look at what has been said also yesterday while launching the Pakistan Economic Survey by the three ministers, do you feel in the last couple of years we have not looked squarely at the issues that pertain to our economy, that are dampening our economic growth? In a certain, how should I say, aggressive manner? Were we too soft on that? Why have we come to this stage? Apart from COVID, what are the other factors do you feel have lent to that?
I think, apart from COVID, the other big factor is that we don't really have any trade within the region. It's less than 5%. And I know there are, all these political tensions and everything, but it takes both sides. And we made an effort a couple of years ago to at least start, importing cotton and some of those things which we have to import from far off sources, and where we have to spend at least 2 to 3 times more because of freight and other things. But then that failed. I think if that had succeeded, perhaps things would not have been that bad. That's one thing. But the other thing is, all these, I mentioned this earlier, this litigation with our foreign investors, and that brings down the confidence. The point I was making previously when I gave the Amir to say something, it was relating to his point about this PSDP and public sector spending. I think despite political touch, parliamentarians and giving shares, etc., but this is an important part of our strategy for creating employment, for growth, and for everything. Because there's a lot of, as Amir already said, I mean, unlike other countries, Pakistan has a lot of these contracts with private sectors, etc., through these PSDP spending. So I think that's a good. It's although many people criticize it, but I feel it's a good thing, because 5 years ago, that we have not even reached the stage where our allocation were 5 years ago. So I think that this is not a bad initiative from the government.
All right. Amir, coming to you, let's talk about development and how important is it to strengthen the development sector. Hassan Iqbal Sahab, when he was talking, I really want to ask you, because it's an interesting point of view that you always give. Hassan Iqbal Sahab said that the development sector took the largest hit. They said that the development budget had been reduced by the previous government and it did not release funds for developmental projects. Do you feel, in your point of view, that development and development projects and per se have been an important part and parcel of our economy, and that whichever kind of budget comes, or whichever government comes in the next year, or how things move forward, each government needs to take into sight the different aspects of our development structure and take measures to strengthen it. In your point of view, what are those measures that need to be taken currently under the current circumstances?
Okay, I mean, first let's define when Hassan Saab says, and we've all had the privilege of working with him, he's a smart man. I have had particularly worked with him during my World Bank days. So the problem is that, when one gives a statement saying development budget, so I look at the budget the way it's apportioned in 3 parts. So I don't do development plus recurrent, right? So it's like CAPEX, OPEX. I look at it as development plus human subsidies or social welfare plus recurrent. Right. So when you look at that, yes, the reason it appears on the books that the last government cut development budgets, but which I already said, the PSDP, for example, this year is going to be less than what it was last year. But where is the more of the money going? That's going into increasing recurrent salaries. So in other words, they are increasing salaries. These salaries, the recurrent budget also includes one of Pakistan's major problems, along with locally, which is the power sector debt, and the second coming up is the energy, gas sector debt, and then it is the pensions, right? And pensions as Javed may be able to tell you, he always has good figures, that is going to take over. So currently, I think the government, what they need to do, and they have promised that they will continue some of these subsidies, which is the part in the middle, right? So the subsidies, they have already said they will continue the Sehat card. They are going to continue some parts of BIS, because if you remember, even BIS has its roots in the pre-PMLN government. So essentially, they will stick with that. Now, what needs to be done? So essentially, what needs to be done is, yes, I agree with Dr. Manzoor under the current circumstances. Number one, that I would not spend money on anything that relates to education or health infrastructure. Our problem in education and health is less infra, it is more services. So we know that, and it's more curriculum, and it's also more the quality of care. So I think that if this infrastructure budget is about building more schools, which I'm quite sure it is, judging from what is being spent, I think I would say that let's spend money on the PSDP, in fact, even increase it to create jobs, immediate jobs, etc., and bring some stability into the economy, but do it in the large infrastructure sector. So do it on the roads, the bridges, the ports, the airports, the large urban areas, etc.